Hello, everyone. I think we are ready to get started. Let's call the case of United States versus Cara Bassett. My name is Judge Poles. Scoring judges, it looks like you've already turned your video and audio off. Remember to keep those off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. And that means the only people that I should be seeing on the screen right now are the advocates and myself, and that looks correct. So I do have a lovely photo of our clerk, our bailiff. All right, can the attorneys please make their appearances?
Yes, Your Honor, good afternoon. My name is Matt Besman, and I'm here with my co-counsel who's off camera, Clay Owens, and together we represent the United States.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Sonali Mehta. I'm joined by my co-counsel, Seva Castleberry.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Mr. Castleberry will be assisting me with the technology involved in today's trial as we represent the defendant, Ms. Cara Bassett.
All right, thank you very much, counsel. We will now be hearing our opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure that they are in speaker view. Switching now. That button, if you don't know, is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking.
Your Honor, just a few pretrial matters before we move to opening statements.
All right.
Your Honor, we would just like to ask your permission if for any reason you can't hear or see us due to the internet connection, just to go ahead and interrupt us and let us know that there's an issue.
Okay, will do.
We also, go ahead, Mr. Besman.
Thank you. Your Honor, just before we begin, the government moves to invoke Rule 615 to constructively sequester all witnesses, save, of course, for the defendant.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor. Although Ms. Bassett isn't here on screen with me, she will be present throughout her trial today.
All right, that motion is granted.
And Your Honor, we would just like to inform the court that before we came to trial today, this case was before Judge Falkenstein for some motion practice. And Judge Falkenstein ruled that all the exhibits in discovery are authentic, and exhibits numbered 4 through 33 are pre-admitted, so they can be used by either side at any time without formally offering them again.
Any objection to that, defense counsel?
No, Your Honor, that's on our understanding as well, and we do intend on referring to some of those exhibits throughout trial today.
Okay. That's my understanding as well, so thank you very much. Anything else from the government?
No, Your Honor, thank you. That's all from us.
Anything else from the defense?
Nothing further, Your Honor. We're ready for opening statements.
All right, let's proceed.
May it please the court. She wanted the park, she wanted the money, so she needed her husband gone. Your Honor, just a moment. Did my video and audio just cut out?
I still have your audio, but your video just came back.
I'm so sorry about that, Your Honor. We're still getting used to this online format. Do you mind if we start over?
That's fine.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. She wanted the park, she wanted the money, so she needed her husband gone. It's August 19th, 2017, and Cara Bassett, the defendant, wakes up to see that her husband isn't home. He won't come home the next day, or the next day, or the next day after that, but you'll learn that the defendant wasn't worried. She didn't try to call him. She didn't send him any text messages. She didn't even contact the authorities until an entire week went by. You'll learn that the defendant wasn't worried because she knew exactly where her husband was. She wasn't worried because she was the one who killed him. She wanted the park. She wanted the money. So she needed her husband gone. Members of the jury, you're going to learn that the defendant and her husband owned an animal park together where they kept elephants. You'll learn that the defendant hated the way her husband treated those animals. He kept them in cramped, dirty cages where there was barely enough room to breathe. But he controlled all the assets, which meant he made all the decisions. The only way that the defendant could turn that park into the animal sanctuary she always wanted it to be is if her husband were to just disappear. And so on August 18th, 2017, the defendant made sure that happened. You're going to learn that she waited until all of her employees went home, and she injected her husband with a lethal elephant tranquilizer called carfentanil. She threw his lifeless body into a van, and she dumped it into a swamp, never to be found again. This defendant made sure her husband went away. And that's why we've charged her with murder. Now, when we made that charge, we took on a burden of proof. It's our job to prove two things beyond a reasonable doubt: that the defendant killed her husband, and that it was intentional and deliberate. To help us meet that burden, you're going to hear from FBI Special Agent Johnson. Steph Johnson is going to take that stand, and she'll walk you through each step of her investigation. She'll tell you about how the defendant waited a week to report her husband missing, about how one of those syringes of carfentanil was missing from the defendant's storeroom, and about how forensic evidence places the defendant at the dump site. Agent Johnson is also going to tell you about how the defendant only waited a few months after her husband's disappearance to transform that park into the sanctuary, just like she always wanted. And members of the jury, that's what I want you to keep in mind throughout today's trial. The defendant got everything she wanted. She got that park. She got that money. And it's all because she made sure her husband was gone. That's why at the end of today's trial, I'm going to come right back up here. And I'm going to ask you to find Kara Bassett guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense counsel?
May it please the court? Unanswered questions. Mr. Besman just came up here and he told you that Don Clark and Kara Bassett were a married couple in 2017. That's true. He told you that Mr. Clark later went missing that same year. That's true too. But members of the jury, he told you that Mr. Clark went missing because of Miss Bassett, that she murdered him. Members of the jury, that's not true. So I'm going to walk you through what happened on August 19th, 2017 from Miss Bassett's perspective. We'll hear that Don Clark was the love of her life. And sure, they fought sometimes about business decisions, but they made it work. You'll learn that Miss Bassett woke up on the morning of August 19th to find that her husband was nowhere to be found. At first, she wasn't worried. He had had a trip planned. But as the days passed, she realized something had to be wrong. So she contacted the police, hoping they would give her some answers. Instead, they accused her of murdering her own husband. Members of the jury, the government has brought this case against Kara Bassett. That means that it's their job to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Bassett intentionally killed her own husband. And members of the jury, they just won't be able to meet that burden today. Because even though Mr. Besman told you she needed her husband gone, the truth is, this is a case with too many unanswered questions. Now, I want you to keep some of those questions in mind throughout today's trial. First, where is the body? See, Mr. Besman just told you that he believes Miss Bassett dumped her husband's body in a swamp. But members of the jury, you'll learn that FBI agents searched that swamp. They tried to find the body, but they didn't find Mr. Clark's body there or anywhere else. That means that you're not going to see an autopsy in today's trial explaining Mr. Clark's time or cause of death. It's because the government just couldn't find that evidence. Next, what does the government's evidence actually prove? See, the government is going to tell you a very specific story today. They believe that Miss Bassett killed her husband using an elephant tranquilizer, drove to a swamp to dump his body, and then drove to an airport. Members of the jury, the truth is you're not going to see any real evidence that supports that story. No DNA evidence or fingerprints placing Miss Bassett at that swamp or the airport. No eyewitnesses. No forensic evidence proving that Miss Bassett even left her home on the night in question. So finally, who else could have done this? You'll hear today that not all of Mr. Clark's business dealings were entirely legitimate. You're going to see that Mr. Clark was interested in purchasing properties in Costa Rica using money that was off the books just months before he disappeared. You'll hear that on the very day he disappeared, he had a phone call and text messages with an unidentified Costa Rican phone number. And members of the jury, I want you to pay attention when Ms. Kwong testifies. See, she was with Mr. Clark when he received those text messages. I want you to pay attention as she describes how he reacted. How the color drained from his face. How he seemed terrified. How he said, I have to go deal with this, and then he left. Members of the jury, the government won't be able to tell you who was on the other end of that phone call. Over the course of today's trial, the government is going to try to get you to forget about those unanswered questions. They're going to tell you that Miss Bassett is a murderer. Members of the jury, I want you to remember that underneath all those accusations is a human being, a grieving widow named Kara Bassett, a woman who woke up one morning to realize her husband was gone and was never coming back. A woman who called the police expecting to find help of finding her husband's murderer. Members of the jury, it's your responsibility to presume that that woman is innocent. It's your responsibility to question the state's accusations, and at the end of this trial, when those questions still don't have answers, it'll be your responsibility to find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Before the government calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone to switch to gallery view, and that button is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. That way you'll be able to see the attorneys and the witness at the same time. All right, government, call your first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The United States calls Special Agent Steph Johnson to the stand. Ma'am, could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Special Agent Steph Johnson with the FBI.
How long have you been an agent with the FBI?
Since 2002. I joined the FBI in 2002, became a special agent in 2003, and a senior special agent, my current title, in 2012.
What sort of work do you do for the agency?
I work for the Criminal Investigations Division, specifically the Violent Crimes section.
So, ma'am, could you tell us how you're involved in today's case?
Of course. I'm the lead investigator in today's case, which began when the defendant, Kara Bassett, reported her then husband, Don Clark, missing on August 25th of 2017.
I want to try to paint a picture for the members of the jury. Tell us more about those people, Kara Bassett and Don Clark.
They were married. Together they owned and operated an elephant park.
Did you ever speak with the defendant to learn what that business relationship was like?
Yes, sir, I did.
What'd you find out?
I found that Mr. Clark wanted to run it like a business. The defendant even referred to it as a zoo, whereas she wanted to run it for the animals like a sanctuary.
So if the two disagreed about how to run the park, who had the final say?
Well, that would have been Mr. Clark. He owned and controlled the property and the park.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation.
In what way do you think the foundation is lacking, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. This witness just testified that Mr. Clark had the final say over operations, but at this point, we don't know how she knows that to be true. We haven't heard the foundation. Did she hear this from a witness? The jury can't, appropriately evaluate this testimony without first hearing that foundation.
Government, can you lay a little more foundation for me?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Sustained.
Agent Johnson, did the defendant tell you who had the final say, whether it was her or her husband?
Yes, sir, she did. She informed me that Mr. Clark owned and controlled the park, so he had those final decisions.
Were you able to figure out how much those assets he owned totaled up to?
Yes, around $8 million.
Did the defendant tell you how that made her feel?
She did. She indicated it to me that it made her furious how he was running the park.
Agent Johnson, I want to show you some pictures. Mr.
Okay.
Owens, can we get exhibits 8 and 23 on the board? Do you know what exhibit 8 tells us?
Yes, and my agents and I took this photo the day that we began investigating, August 25th, 2017. This was how the elephants were kept.
And what about exhibit 23?
This is a more recent photo of the park, what it looks like now, with the elephants roaming free rather than being in those small cages.
So when exactly did you get involved in this case? What was the date, if you remember?
August 25th of 2017, when the defendant reported Mr. Clark missing.
When did the defendant tell you she noticed her husband was gone?
That was actually a week prior to reporting him missing, on August 18th of 2017.
Were you able to figure out what the defendant did during that week when her husband was allegedly missing?
Yes, sir. We subpoenaed her phone records as well as his phone records.
What did you learn?
We learned that at no point during that week had the defendant attempted to call or text Mr. Clark.
So did you ever go to that elephant park?
Yes, sir, we did, the very day we started the investigation.
Did you see anything there that could be used as a weapon?
Actually, we did. When we searched some medical supplies, we found syringes of elephant tranquilizer, which contained carfentanil.
Agent Johnson, is elephant tranquilizer really a potential weapon?
Actually, sir, it is. Carfentanil is deadly in humans at even a minuscule dose.
Mr. Owens, could we get exhibit 17 on the board? Do you know what this is, Agent Johnson?
Yes, sir. This is the material safety data sheet for carfentanil, which was the substance in those elephant tranquilizers.
And how much carfentanil does this say it takes to kill a human being?
It says that it's fatal if only 1 milligram or more is swallowed or injected.
How much carfentanil was in those syringes?
In a single syringe, there were 10 times that amount, 10 milligrams.
So how many of these syringes were supposed to be at the elephant park?
Well, according to a log the parks themselves kept, there were supposed to be 24 syringes in their possession.
Mr. Owens, can we get that log, exhibit 19? Did you find all 24 of those syringes?
No, sir. We only counted 23. One syringe was missing and unaccounted for.
Who was the last person to check out a syringe according to this log?
The initials are CC, which was Kara Bassett, when she was married to Don Clark.
How do you know those initials CC don't stand for somebody else?
Well, we actually asked her about this, and she indicated to us that was her handwriting.
So since you started looking at those syringes as potential weapons, did you find Mr. Clark's body at the park?
No, we did not.
Did you find anything that could transport a body?
We did. The defendant informed us that she had actually discovered a park van was at a nearby airport about 5 miles away.
Did you find anything in that van that led you to believe it might have transported Mr. Clark's body?
Yes, sir. The forensics team swept the van and we found some of Mr. Clark's bodily evidence in the back in the unseated area of that van.
So were you able to figure out where that van was on the night of the 18th, the night Mr. Clark went missing?
We were. The van had a built-in navigation system that recorded the times and locations the van was, and we found information for the date of his disappearance, August 18th.
Mr. Owens, can we get Exhibit 31, the GPS data? So, ma'am, where did that van start on the night of the 18th?
It started at the park, which again was also where the defendant and Mr. Clark lived.
Then where did it go?
It traveled 139 miles to a place called Big Gum Swamp, where it remained for 44 minutes.
So did you go to that swamp?
Yes, sir, we did. That was our next step.
Did you search for Mr. Clark's body at that swamp?
We did. Unfortunately, that swamp is 13,000 acres and is infested with alligators, so we were not able to recover the body.
Were you able to find any other forensic evidence at that swamp?
We were. We took some samples of algae that was found on the swamp, and our forensics team was able to give a precise match of that algae to evidence found in the van.
Did you happen to test that algae against any objects you recovered from the park?
Yes, sir. We tested it against the bottom of the defendant's boots, as well as the bottom of a wheelchair that the park owned. Again, these were matches.
So let me ask you, what was it that the forensics team concluded matched between the defendant's boots and the dirt found at the swamp?
There is a specific strain of algae that's very rare in the type of combination that we saw at the bottom of these boots, at the pedals and the floorboard of that van, and that swamp, the Big Gum Swamp that the van had traveled to.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion.
In what way, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. This testimony about the specific types of algae, or whether or not they're rare in various locations, Your Honor, that's the improper opinion that I'm objecting to. Agent Johnson certainly doesn't have any scientific qualifications to make those statements.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, Exhibit 5, which my co-counsel just showed part of, is one of those exhibits that's been pre-admitted before trial. Now, Exhibit 5 is the forensic report, which specifically says that the combination of algae found on the boots and the swamp was rare. So there's no improper opinion because the opinion is in an admissible piece of evidence, an admitted piece of evidence.
Defense counsel, isn't that true? Don't we already have the evidence actually in? So what's the harm of having the investigator discuss it?
Yes, Your Honor. We agree that Exhibit 5 is, of course, already in evidence. However, it's the agent testifying about the specific scientific contents and procedures that led to that forensic report. Your Honor, it's our belief that that report doesn't state exactly what the witness testified. If what she's saying is based on what she read the report, she should tell the jury that.
May I respond to that, Your Honor? Oh, I'm so
Briefly,
sorry.
yes.
Your Honor, I just wanted to say that that's exactly what the witness did. The witness said what the forensic team found, and if opposing counsel believes that doesn't represent the exhibit, that's a matter for cross-examination.
I'm going to overrule the objection and allow the witness to continue testifying.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, ma'am, after your forensics team found that match, did you ask the defendant why she had gone to the swamp?
Of course.
What did she say?
She denied ever having been at the swamp.
Thank you, Agent Johnson. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Hi, Agent Johnson. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Can you see and hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. Now, Agent, I want to start by talking about the evidence you did and didn't find as part of your investigation, starting with the body. Now, Agent, you told us on direct examination you believe Mr. Clark's body ended up in the Big Gum Swamp. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Ma'am, you actually searched the swamp, didn't you?
Yes, as I mentioned on direct examination.
You were helped by a team of investigators?
That's correct.
You had trained police dogs sniffing to see if they could find Mr. Clark's body?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, you didn't find the body in that swamp, isn't that right?
That's true. As I mentioned, unfortunately, it was 13,000 acres and infested with alligators. And he hadn't been reported missing until a week after.
Well, ma'am, you also searched the elephant park, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, we did.
You didn't find the body there, right?
No, ma'am.
Ma'am, because of that, You can't bring us an autopsy report here in court, is that right?
That's true.
Ma'am, you can't tell us the specific time that Mr. Clark died, right?
That is true, not the specific time.
You told us you believe he was injected with a tranquilizer, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, I want to be clear. What you found was a missing tranquilizer, right?
That's precisely it. The defendant couldn't account for this when it was supposed to have been logged.
Well, ma'am, what you don't have is a toxicology report proving that tranquilizer ended up in Mr. Clark's blood, right?
That's true.
Ma'am, and ma'am, to be clear, you also never find the tranquilizer itself that you believe is the murder weapon.
That's precisely right. It's still missing, still unaccounted for.
Ma'am, you didn't find the syringe. You didn't find a murder weapon. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. Still missing, still unaccounted for.
So no body, no murder weapon. I want to talk about something you did find. You told us you found this forensic evidence relating to algae. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
You told us that your team tested the mud at the swamp and the mud on Miss Bassett's boots and found a match. Do I have that right?
Yes, as well as a match to the gas pedal, the brake pedal, and the floorboard of that van.
Ma'am, I'm going to take a closer look at what your forensics team actually found. Mr. Castleberry, could we get the report on the screen? So, ma'am, this is that forensic report. We were just talking about it, right?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
I want to focus in on the conclusions related to algae.
Okay.
Follow along as I read aloud. We did not test or collect any samples from the Big Gum Swamp against any natural substances, dirt, watering holes, at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park or other Florida swamps. Ma'am, the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, that's where Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark lived and worked, is that right?
That's true, that's where they resided.
So I want to be clear here. Your team didn't take any mud samples from the place where Miss Bassett worked, is that right?
No, because we found a precise match between the algae at the swamp and the evidence of the van, which was owned by the park, as well as the wheelchair owned by the park.
Miss Agent Johnson, that's a no to my question. You didn't take any samples from that elephant park, right?
We didn't take samples of dirt from the elephant park, true.
So I want to be clear, you can't tell us whether or not the dirt in the van or on Miss Bassett's shoes matched the place where she worked. Is that right?
No, but I can tell you it's a precise match to that swamp.
Ma'am, you're saying it's a precise match. I want to be clear. In the mud from the swamp, there were two kinds of algae.
Yes, ma'am.
You found those same kinds of algae on the boots, right?
Yes, ma'am, to the exact same ratio.
And you have no idea what kind of algae exists at the Tallahassee Elephant Park, right?
That's correct. We didn't test the dirt at the elephant park.
Ma'am, I want to ask you about who else might have been involved in this case. Now, you received a letter from Mr. Clark's attorney as part of your work in this case, right?
That's true.
Mr. Castleberry, could we get that letter on the screen? Agent, this document is the letter, right?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Now, I want to focus in on the part where the attorney wrote you about properties in Costa Rica owned by Mr. Clark.
Okay.
You know that Mr. Clark was looking into buying properties in Costa Rica, right?
That's what this letter from his attorney indicates.
The attorney told you that he was going to use cash off the books, right?
That's what this letter says.
Ma'am, that was on August 4th, 2017, right?
That's true.
About a week before Mr. Clark went missing?
A couple of weeks, yes.
Ma'am, you know that Mr. Clark was actually in contact with individuals from Costa Rica on the day that he disappeared, right?
That's correct. That's why we interviewed law enforcement officers in Costa Rica.
Well, ma'am, specifically, you know he received 2 text messages from an unidentified Costa Rican phone number, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Those text messages were in Spanish, yes?
Yes.
But they said, they translate to call me immediately.
Yes, that's the translation.
You know that Mr. Clark did call that phone number immediately, right?
Yes, that's what his phone records indicated.
He made a phone call to that same unidentified Costa Rican phone number that lasted 52 minutes. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Ma'am, I want to keep track of all of this testimony on a timeline. Mr. Castleberry, could you bring that up for us? So, ma'am, you told us about those 2 text messages that said, call me immediately. Those came in at 6 p.m. Is that right?
Yes.
You know that Mr. Clark made a phone call immediately to that same number from 6 p.m. to 6:52 p.m.
Yes.
And you know he went missing just hours later that same night, right?
That's true. Yes.
Agent Johnson, you can see the phone number up on the screen, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You don't know who that phone number belongs to.
It's an unlisted phone number.
So that's a no to my question, Agent. You don't know who that phone number belongs to.
That's a no.
You don't know what was discussed on that phone call?
No, ma'am. Unfortunately, Dawn disappeared.
To this day, you don't know who Mr. Clark was in contact with just hours before he died. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. That's 6 to 6:52 phone call.
Thank you, Agent Johnson. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time.
Is there any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. May the witness be excused?
Yes, they're excused. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the government?
No, Your Honor. The government rests our case in chief.
All right. Defense, ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Ms. Jo Kwong to the stand. Hi, Ms. Kwong. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Now, could you start by introducing yourself to the members of the jury?
Sure. My name is Jo Kwong.
What do you do for work?
I'm a documentary filmmaker. You actually may have seen some of the stuff I've worked on. Best in Show? Are there aliens? No? That's okay.
Well, ma'am, do you know somebody named Kara Bassett?
Oh yeah, I know Kara. She runs an elephant park nearby with her husband, or she did. And we worked together to film a documentary about the highs and lows and dramas of the elephant park.
Well, ma'am, when did you start filming that documentary?
We started filming, oh gosh, it was back in 2015.
Ma'am, did Ms. Bassett pay you for your work?
Yes, she did. We came to an agreement that she would pay me $5,000 per month, and then I'd get 20% of the revenue once the film was released.
So, ma'am, where were you filming this documentary?
At her elephant park. We would go around and document everything they did, what happened, the visitors, things like that.
Did you become familiar with Mr. Clark and Ms. Bassett in the time that you were working on this project?
Yes, I definitely did. I was there 5 days a week for years. And so, we got to know each other pretty well.
All right, ma'am. Now, I want to ask you about a specific piece of evidence we've heard about today, an elephant tranquilizer. Have you ever seen anything like that at the elephant park?
Yeah, I did. And the needle's pretty big, so it's kind of scary for me. But they just use them if the elephants are getting angry or if they're hurt and they need to be sedated.
What kind of people did you see using the tranquilizers?
It was mostly trained staff, and then the doctors did as well.
Ma'am, did you see where they were stored?
Yeah, they were stored in the shed on the back of the property.
Did you ever see how many people had access to that shed?
From what I saw and from what I know, about a dozen people had access to the shed.
All right, ma'am. Now, I want to ask you about Mr. Clark in particular. Now, this may seem like a little bit of a strange question, but do you know if Mr. Clark owned a plane?
Oh, yeah, I do.
Well, have you ever seen that plane or been in it?
Yes, I got to go there a couple times. It's pretty cool. It has a mini fridge and everything. And even took me up and flew me around.
Well, ma'am, so ma'am, that's a yes. You've flown with Mr. Clark in that plane, is that right?
Yes, I
Objection
did.
to leading, Your Honor.
Can you rephrase the question, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Ma'am, have you ever flown in that plane with Mr. Clark?
Yes, I have.
Ma'am, I want to go ahead and turn your attention to the day in question that Mr. Clark went missing, all right?
Sure.
Were you at the elephant park that day?
I was, yes. I was with Kara for most of it, just walking around and filming everything. And then Dawn stopped by a little bit later.
So, ma'am, in the time that you were with Miss Bassett on August 17th, did she seem nervous?
No, not at all.
Did she seem upset?
No, she didn't. Just acting pretty normal.
Well, did you overhear any conversations between Mr. Clark and Miss Bassett on that day?
Oh, yeah, I did. I'm not a snoop or anything, but they were talking kind of loud. It was something about Costa Rica.
What did you hear Miss Bassett say?
She said, "Sweetheart, you can go without me." Classic Kara.
Objection to hearsay, Your Honor.
Response to the hearsay objection?
Yes, Your Honor. We're not using this statement for the truth of the matter asserted that Mr. Clark did in fact go to Costa Rica. Of course, he went missing, so we don't know whether or not he actually went. We're using this to show that the defendant, Miss Bassett, was on notice, that it was a possibility her husband was going to Costa Rica. And that rebuts the government's claim that she should have immediately called the police on August 19th. What matters here is that the defendant believed the statement to be true, not that it's actually true.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, it's been the defense's contention throughout this entire case that somebody in Costa Rica is related to Mr. Clark's disappearance. The truth of the matter asserted that Mr. Clark was going to Costa Rica is integral to that theory.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, briefly.
It's not our theory of the case that Mr. Clark definitely died in Costa Rica. The fact is we don't know because his body was never found. We're using this statement to show that Miss Bassett was on notice her husband might be going, and because of that, she didn't call the police immediately after realizing he was gone, like the prosecution has been alleging throughout today's trial, beginning in opening statements.
All right, I'm going to overrule the objection, but the jury will be advised that the statement is only admitted for the effect it had on Miss Bassett.
Understood, Your Honor. So, Ms. Kwong, you were telling us what Miss Bassett said in the phone call. Could you finish?
Yeah, for sure. Like I mentioned, they were talking about Costa Rica, and Kara said something like, "Sweetheart, it's fine, you can go without me."
On that day, did you ever see Miss Bassett yell at her husband?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Did you see her fight with her husband?
No, I didn't.
All right, ma'am, now I want to talk about how Mr. Clark was acting on that day. Did you see Mr. Clark at all on August 18th?
I did. He came by that evening.
And what time was it that you saw him?
It was about 6 p.m.
Well, Ms. Kwong, I know it was a long time ago, but do you remember whether or not Mr. Clark had his phone with him?
Yeah, I do. I remember because it was kind of weird. When he pulled it out, his face just went white.
Well, Ms. Kwong, let's break this down. Did you see what was on his phone screen at that time?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so you saw, but what you did see is he looked at his phone, is that right?
Objection to leading, Your Honor.
Your Honor, this fact is already on the record. This witness just testified to it. I was just restating it for the jury.
I'm going to allow it, but counsel, be careful. Watch the leading.
Yes, Your Honor. So Ms. Bassett, excuse me, Ms. Kwong, how did Mr. Clark react after looking down at his phone?
Like I said, as soon as he pulled it out and looked down at it, his face just went white. He seemed scared.
Well, did he say anything?
Yeah, he said, "I have to go deal with this," and left immediately.
Well, ma'am, I want to put that testimony on a timeline. Your Honor, it's that same timeline from before, but we've redacted the testimony from the police officer that previously testified. So, Ms. Kwong, after Mr. Clark said, "I have to deal with this," and left, did you ever see him again?
No, I didn't see him again.
Did you ever have contact of any kind with him ever again?
No, he never reached out to me.
Do you know if he reached out to anybody else that you know?
Yeah, Kara showed me this text message that Dawn sent her.
What did the text message say?
It just said, "going out for a while."
And what time was this text message sent from Mr. Clark to Miss Bassett?
It was sent later that night, I think at 11:14ish.
After that time, did you ever hear or see from Mr. Clark ever again?
No, I didn't.
Thank you, Ms. Kwong. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Kwong. How are you today?
Good afternoon. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm glad to hear it. Now, you told us on direct examination a little bit about some Costa Rica conversations, right?
Yes, I did.
You told us about some things that you're claiming you heard the defendant say.
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about the reason behind some of that testimony. So like you said on direct examination, you get paid by the defendant, right?
I was up until about September 2018. I'm not being paid anymore.
Right, you ended at September 2018, but you started in August 2015, right?
That's right, working on the documentary.
And you were making $5,000 a month throughout that entire time.
I was. Based on my experience and the time I'd have to spend there, we both thought it was reasonable.
That's 3 years and a month, right?
Yes, it is.
So that's $185,000 in your bank account, courtesy of the defendant.
After tax and paying for my expenses and everything, it's a little less than that.
More dynamic, she's cleaner. His demos are shit.
But that's the amount I was paying. Sorry.
Oh, you're totally fine. So it's $185,000 minus tax.
Yes, exactly.
And you actually stand to make a lot more money than that from your relationship with the defendant. Isn't that true?
If you're talking about the fact that we might actually get to release it on a streaming service, I'm so excited. Yes, hopefully it'll be a big hit.
The defendant has promised you to give 20% of everything she makes from that documentary, right?
Right, that's exactly what we agreed to a few years ago.
So that's looking like $2 million you stand to make from the defendant. Isn't that true?
I hope so. No one signed off on the deal yet or anything, but fingers crossed it'll work out.
But you're hoping you get that $2 million as you sit there and testify today, right?
Yeah, it's all based on what the streaming service decides.
So now I want to talk a little bit about what you saw when you were with Ms. Bassett and Mr. Clark.
Sure.
You told us that they would sometimes get into arguments, right?
They would, yeah. They disagreed a bit about how the park was run.
That's right. You heard them fighting about whether the park should be more like a zoo or a sanctuary.
Yes, they did.
And these fights, they started getting worse and worse as you got closer to August. Isn't that right?
They were pretty minor in the beginning, and I can think of one major argument. But the relationship actually started to get better after that one, about 2 months before his disappearance.
Well, I want to explore that a little bit.
Sure.
You know, one time when they were fighting about the park, the defendant actually threw a vase at her husband's head.
Objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 404, this is improper character evidence.
In what way?
Your Honor, they're using this prior act by the defendant, that she threw a vase against her husband's head, this violent act, to suggest that it's more likely, as propensity evidence, that she did the same thing in this case, that she acted violently towards her husband. It's improper character evidence, Your Honor.
Government, would you like to respond?
Yes, Your Honor. We aren't offering this evidence to prove any character trait of violence under Rule 404A. We're offering it to show motive under Rule 404B. Now, it's the government's claim in this case that the crime was motivated by anger about how the park was being run. The fact that Kara Bassett got so angry that she threw a vase at her husband's head about how the park was being run goes to show that motive, which is explicitly permitted under 404B.
May I respond, Your Honor, as to 404B? Your Honor, we have no problem with this testimony about the arguments they had related to the sanctuary. However, it's this specific action that we're objecting to, that Ms. Bassett threw something, acted violently towards her husband. Your Honor, as you already know, there are no eyewitnesses in today's case who will be able to testify that they saw Ms. Bassett acting violently on the day of. So they're using this for propensity purposes. Because she did this violent action in the past, it's more likely that she murdered her husband. That's what they're using this evidence for, Your Honor.
May I respond briefly, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, that act goes to show the extent of the motive that Kara Bassett had. And it goes to rebut the claim that these arguments were just minor, indicating that the motive wasn't actually that strong.
Okay, assuming that is going to be argued for purposes of motive, I'm going to overrule the objection. Counsel, if he argues it differently in closing, you can re-raise your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, ma'am, you saw the defendant throw a vase at her husband's head while they were arguing about that park, right?
I did. Thankfully, it didn't hit him.
That's right. It hit a wall and it shattered, right?
That's right, yes.
Now, you told us on direct examination that you were there to film the highs, the lows, and the dramas of the relationship, right?
Of the park, but yes.
But there's some of that drama you weren't allowed to film. Isn't that true?
Yeah, Kara asked me to erase some things just because she wanted to protect the privacy of, their marriage.
Well, let's take things one step at a time. The defendant told you, whenever I'm fighting with my husband, you can't be filming, right?
Yes.
And the couple times that you did manage to get it on footage, the defendant said you need to erase that.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? May I explain?
Yes.
Your Honor, the fact that Ms. Bassett didn't want her arguments with her husband to be broadcasted to the world on a reality television show doesn't make it any more or less likely that she had anything to do with his disappearance. It's simply not relevant to what we're trying to decide here in court today.
May I respond to that?
What is the relevance?
Yes, Your Honor. It goes to show consciousness on the part of the defendant of guilt and a plan. It goes to show that the defendant knew she may one day take action based on these disagreements, and she didn't want there to be evidence that proves them. That's the relevance.
Well, based on that argument, I think it's too attenuated. I'm going to sustain the objection.
Move to strike the testimony, Your Honor.
Motion to strike granted.
Now, ma'am, about 2 months before Mr. Clark disappeared, you got some things of the defendants on footage, right?
Yes, I have a lot of footage. Could you be a little bit more specific?
Sure. So before trial, you were showing a couple of specific clips, weren't you?
Yes, about 10.
You were showing one clip that we told you was going to be marked Exhibit 38, right?
I believe so, yes.
And when we showed it to you, it hadn't been changed or altered in any way since the last time you saw it.
No, it hadn't.
Your Honor, the United States offers Exhibit 38 into evidence.
Any objection?
Yeah, I was muted. Yes, Your Honor. Objection under Rule 403.
What's the prejudice that you're concerned about?
Yes, Your Honor. As we know, this interview was filmed for a reality TV show. We don't have any context to know whether Ms. Bassett was being truthful, truthful, whether she was told to dramatize for the purpose of a television show. To use this interview that was recorded for a television show in a court of law is highly prejudicial, Your Honor.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, that goes to weight, not admissibility. If defense counsel is arguing that their client might have been lying in this video, and that's another thing for the members of the jury to consider entirely, but none of it is unfairly prejudicial as required by Rule 403.
I think it does go to weight, not admissibility. The objection is overruled. It's received.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Owens, can we play that video?
I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Ms. Kwong, you heard the defendant talking about protecting her elephants a lot, right?
Yes, I did. You should have seen her. She would make calls, she'd talk to people. She was willing to do anything to make sure animal cruelty across the world was going to be prevented.
You noticed that she sometimes got angry when she talked about that, right?
Sometimes. I mean, she was just very passionate, especially about like elephant hunting, for example.
And that anger, it was directed often at one person, right?
No, like I said, she was lobbying senators and she wanted to change things across the nation.
You heard the defendant talking about being angry at her husband for how he was treating the animals, didn't you?
Yes, sometimes she did say things like that.
Ma'am, another video clip we showed you before trial, we said it was going to be labeled Exhibit 36, right?
Yes, I believe so.
And that video clip, it's also a fair and accurate representation of the video you took?
I believe so, yes.
The United States offers Exhibit 36 into evidence.
Any objection?
Excuse me, Your Honor, we maintain our 403 objection for appeal, but none if that's already been overruled.
All right, overruled then. Thank you. It's admitted.
Mr. Owens, can we play that video?
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Thank you, Ms. Kwong. No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect examination, Your Honor.
Okay, anything further from the defense?
Nothing further, Your Honor. We rest our case in chief and are ready to move to closing statements.
All right, we will now be hearing closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. And since both witnesses have completed their testimony, you can complete the witness portion of your ballot.
Closing for the government, Your Honor?
Yes, you may proceed.
May it please the court. She wanted the park. She wanted the money, so she needed her husband gone. Members of the jury, if you try to understand this defendant's actions out of context, it might not make a lot of sense. It might seem strange that somebody would kill their husband just to take control of a business. That's because if you want to really understand the tragedy, that is the story of Kara Bassett and Don Clark, you have to go back. You have to rewind back before this defendant threw her husband's corpse into a swamp, back before this defendant stuck a syringe of elephant tranquilizer in his body, back before this defendant hatched her plan. And what you're going to find is a defendant who had no other options. Because she wanted the park, and she wanted the money, so she needed her husband gone. Let's start with that park. Members of the jury, this is how Don Clark kept his elephants. If you're an animal lover like Kara Bassett, it's hard to even look at a photo like that. But she had to live that life. The defendant had to go to work every day and walk past these cramped, dirty cages, knowing there's nothing she could do about it. Because that brings us to the money. And the sad truth is, Don Clark had it, the defendant didn't. That meant that Don Clark got to make all the decisions. Don Clark decided how the elephants were treated. Don Clark decided what the guests could do. Don Clark ran the park, and there was no choice that the defendant could make. Well, there was maybe one choice. The defendant could make her husband go away. And so one by one, things around this defendant began to disappear. It started with a syringe of elephant tranquilizer, a dangerous drug called carfentanil that was in the storerooms one day and then gone. Next, It was the park van, big enough to carry an animal or a body. And last, it was Don Clark himself, wiped off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. But here's the thing about disappearing acts. They might seem like magic. They never really are. When you look close enough, you can always see past the smoke and mirrors and find the human beings who are really controlling the strings. Sometimes that's difficult. Some people are really good at covering their tracks, but this defendant made it painfully easy for you. Because that syringe full of elephant tranquilizer, she checked it out in a logbook, wrote her initials, and then verified to the FBI that it was her handwriting. That van that was spirited away in the middle of the night, she left her husband's DNA in the back of it, and she chose a vehicle that had a passive GPS tracker, which allowed the FBI to see every place she went as she transported her husband's body to the swamp. And speaking of that husband, just a few months before he disappeared, the defendant filmed this video and let her documentarian post it for the world to see. Take a listen.
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
A master illusionist, this defendant is not. She planted red flags along each step of her plan, which made it easy for our office to put the pieces together and turn it into the case we presented to you today. Today, it was our job to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Kara Bassett murdered her husband. What that means is that we had to prove two things. First, that Kara Bassett killed Don Clark. And then second, that it was intentional and deliberate. But the defense wants to try to distract you from all the evidence. The defense wants to try to tell you, no, it had something to do with Costa Rica. There was a call to somebody in Costa Rica. So maybe that was it. Members of the jury, I want you to think about that. How did somebody in Costa Rica kill Don Clark? How did somebody in Costa Rica manage to get that evidence on the defendant's boots? How did somebody in Costa Rica manage to get that elephant tranquilizer out of the log? It doesn't make sense because it isn't supposed to. It's supposed to be something to talk about so that you don't think about the evidence in this case. But members of the jury, that evidence is overwhelming. So when Miss Mehta comes before you and she says, oh, the defendant was never actually at that swamp, you can tell her, no, I've seen the forensics. When Miss Mehta comes before you and tells you she never touched that tranquilizer, you could tell her, no, I've seen the logs. When Miss Mehta comes before you and tells you that her client is innocent, you could say, I'm sorry, no, I've seen the proof. And that's why we're going to ask you to find this defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense counsel, are you ready to proceed?
Your Honor, I believe defense counsel's power may have gone out. If we could just wait a moment.
Yes, of course. My understanding is we have people working on this, but we still do not have defense counsel. So let's just take a break until there's our bail.
We are waiting to contact, well, Professor Bernstein is contacting defense counsel. So we should get this sorted out momentarily. Just if everyone can just sit tight for a second.
Do we know at what point she dropped off?
We don't, and I'm assuming that Justin is going to sort that out. So I don't know.
I didn't notice either. Okay, thank you. Should we, the prosecution's closing?
I'm sorry, say that again, Susan?
Can we assume that the defense attorney was able to hear the government's closing?
Yes, we will assume that. Thank you. All right, I'm going to send her back into the room now. Thank you all for your patience.
Thank you. Ms. Mehta, we're very happy to have you back.
Happy to be back. Sorry for the delay. There's a storm where I am and all our power went out briefly.
The lovely craziness of trial by Zoom.
Absolutely.
Are you ready to begin your defense closing argument?
Your Honor, if I could have just a moment, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Take the time you need.
Your Honor, I'm ready to proceed. And Mr. Besman, I apologize. I did miss most of your speech, so.
I'm so sorry about that, ma'am. No problem at all.
May it please the court?
Yes.
Unanswered questions. Members of the jury, what you heard today about what happened to Mr. Clark is a tragedy. As the defense, we know that Mr. Clark's family does deserve justice. His children do deserve closure. Not like this. Because what we saw in today's case was a case with too many unanswered questions. And a case like that, well, it doesn't give you closure. It doesn't give you justice. It just leaves you with doubt. And that's important, members of the jury, because remember, it was the government's job today to prove to you that Miss Bassett killed her own husband beyond a reasonable doubt. But they just weren't able to meet that burden today. To show you why, I want to go back through each of those 3 questions I asked you to keep in mind at the beginning of today's trial. First, where is the body? Members of the jury, you heard from FBI Agent Johnson. They searched the swamp. They searched the elephant park. They weren't able to find Mr. Clark's body. And because of that, we don't know when Mr. Clark died. We don't know how Mr. Clark died. We don't know where Mr. Clark died. We don't know if he died in Costa Rica or in Florida or in somewhere else. We don't know if he was killed with an elephant tranquilizer or if he was shot or if it was something else altogether. Fact is, members of the jury, we just don't know. Second, what does their evidence actually prove? See, members of the jury, at the beginning of today's trial, Mr. Besman came up here and he made you a promise. He told you they were going to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a big promise. And when he said that, I wonder what you thought you'd see. A murder weapon? Any eyewitnesses saying they saw Miss Bassett do what the government claims? DNA evidence tying her to the swamp or to the airport or to anything else involved in this crime? No, members of the jury, instead, all the government was able to bring you was some mud on some boots. But remember, they told you that mud on the boots matched the swamp, so she had to have committed this crime. But members of the jury, the government didn't even bother to test the mud at the place where she worked, that zoo. They can't tell you for sure whether that mud came from the swamp because they didn't bother to check. Members of the jury, what does their evidence actually prove? Mud on some boots? Well, that proves she worked at a zoo. Mud in a van? That proves she drove the van for work. her husband left her some property. That proves a husband loved his wife. And members of the jury, if their evidence proves something other than the fact Miss Bassett killed her own husband, then that means they didn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. So that brings me to that last question. Who else could have done this? Members of the jury, today we showed you exactly who. You learned that before he died, Mr. Clark was looking into purchasing properties in Costa Rica using cash off the books. You heard about who he was in contact with on the same day that he died, at 6 p.m., just hours before he died. He texted this number, and they said, call me immediately. So Mr. Clark did. He had a 52-minute phone call with that person. He turned white. All the color drained out of his face. He left. He said, I have to deal with this. And then a few hours later, he texted his wife he was going out for a while. Members of the jury, don't you think it's possible that the person on the other end of that phone wanted Mr. Clark to disappear? And sure, maybe that phone call was totally innocuous, but maybe not. Maybe Mr. Clark was injected with an elephant tranquilizer, but maybe not. Maybe the algae they found on her boots only exists in one swamp in all of Florida. But maybe not. And maybe or maybe not, that just isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So instead, to prove that Miss Bassett had a motive, to prove to you that she needed that money, she wanted the park, they brought you some video clips from a documentary. But members of the jury, remember those video clips are from a reality television show. Of course, Miss Bassett would complain about her husband. Of course, she would be dramatic. It was for a television show. That's what those are for. Members of the jury, they showed you those videos and tried to tell you that it was a confession. But real killers don't go on TV interviews and confess to their crimes. And Miss Bassett wasn't confessing because she had nothing to confess to. It was an interview for a reality TV show, nothing more, nothing less. Now, in a minute, Mr. Besman is going to get back up here, and he's going to ask you to forget about those 3 questions they can't answer. But he doesn't get to do that, members of the jury. See, it's your job to demand answers to those questions. It's your job to question what the government tells you is true. It's your job to make sure they do their job. And they didn't. That's why we're asking you to find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Rebuttal from the government?
Yes, Your Honor. Let's imagine for a moment that what Miss Mehta told you was true, and the defendant is innocent. Let's imagine that she waited a week to call the police because she really did think her husband was just in Costa Rica, and she had that text message that says going out for a while. Well, if we're in that world, at some point, the defendant thought that her husband was missing. At some point, she got worried because she called the FBI. And that leaves us with a question. Why wouldn't she try calling her husband first? Why wouldn't she text her husband first? Why wouldn't she try to communicate with him unless she knew he couldn't answer? Members of the jury, the reason that the defendant didn't try to reach out to her husband is because she had no unanswered questions. She knew that he was dead and at the bottom of a swamp. There's no innocent explanation for those actions because the defendant isn't innocent at all. Find Kara Bassett guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, counsel. All right, at this time, the judges should be completing their ballots and clicking submit, and I'll ask everyone just to stay on the call until we have those ballots submitted, and then we'll do some brief comments.